What's your advice to a skeptical contrarian covering Davos? I don't want to just be a bomb thrower, so to speak. I don't want to just be a gotcha guy. I actually want to ask questions that reveal the truth. What should I do?
Frankly, you've got to ask them what words that they use mean. They've got an army of buzzwords. Sustainability is probably the hottest ticket item, but resilience and inclusion and these kind of words we become familiar with having a toxic aura around them. It'd be fun to, in my opinion, to kind of catch them out and say, when you say resilience, what specifically do you mean? And let them kind of speak to their BS. When you say sustainable, do you mean that you expect the institutions of the West to subscribe to, actively promote the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations? What's the relationship between the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and its so-called Agenda 2030 to transform our world? Those kinds of questions, I think, are at the top of the list of things that we should be pressing people on right now.
You know what I like about your answer to me is that that's a real information gathering question. It's not even an attack. It's trying to coax them out from beyond the paper thin. I mean, they have this message track: sustainability, climate action, these words, and they're never asked to follow up. They're never asked, well, what do you mean? Or how does that work? Or how does it contradict or complement? So they only have this shallow message because they've never engaged in a back and forth debate. So simply asking them, what do you mean? Which is really the basic question of all journalism. I mean, 90% of journalism could be just done with what do you mean? That question.
Yeah, well, I mean, for a couple of examples, the United Nations, or UNESCO more specifically, has put out a number of documents in the last 2 to 3 years, several last year, specifically saying that all colleges and higher education institutions and all primary and secondary education needs to be bent toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Our schools, literally children in kindergarten being taught what is world hunger. This is an agenda item that's not just coming down from UNESCO, but has now been repeated by the National Education Association Foundation in the United States in official documents, and putting out a booklet of curriculum. So when you have the opportunity to talk to these hyper elite stakeholder technocrats, you should ask them, do you intend to teach 5-year-olds to try to meet the United Nations Sustainable Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and why? Why are 5-year-olds necessary to get on board with this agenda to solve world problems?
Yeah. I'm thinking about some of the other buzzwords they throw around, and these buzzwords, it's like a language of a secret society. I mean, lawyers do it. Lawyers drop Latin words all the time. And I mean, partly because that's an ancient tradition. I mean, the law is centuries or even millennia old. So there is a legitimate reason for it. But part of it is that they're a secret priesthood, a guild, and you're not in it. And you must obey them, and you must defer to their authority, and you must hire them and pay them because they're better than you. Academics are the worst at that. They use made up words. They write not to explain, but to obscure. And the more obscure, the better. It's a buzzword. It's like DIE, diversity, inclusion, and equity. SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. Just the acronyms alone. But I don't know if any of them actually think about what those words really, really mean. How can you be for inclusion at Davos when you don't let the public in? When you have to have a private jet and $100,000 to get a ticket?
I've heard this year over $400,000 actually to get a ticket.
Wow. Now, what do you make of the journalists who are on the inside? There must be a tacit agreement. In fact, it's probably not even tacit. They probably have to sign a non-disclosure agreement that they're on the inside and they're not going to blab.
You have said it. They are likely to be getting their marching orders. They want to be part of the club. They're not there to report on what's going on. They're there to report the new narrative, the new agenda. Within the Davos meeting, and I don't draw this from some conspiracy, I read this book that the World Economic Forum published 10 years ago or 12 years ago called World Economic Forum, the First 40 Years, which they told what they do year by year by year, all 40 years of 1971 through 2010. And they explain that they have closed door meetings within Davos journalists as well that subscribe to things like Chatham House rules, where you can report on what was said, but you can't say who said it. You can't rat them out. And there are these kind of tacit agreements to subscribe to the Davos agenda, the Davos manifesto, or the Davos pledge. And so if you're on the inside, you're probably there because you've agreed to whatever set of agreements that they've put forth in those regards. They've said so more or less explicitly. So I think that the journalists on the inside are not there to ask legitimate questions. And as we saw last year, Jack Posobiec, representing, I think he was for Human Events Daily last year, went over and was filming and asking questions, and they surrounded him with guards and machine guns and demanded to confiscate his footage and all of these things. He ended up being fine, but they weren't very happy that there were actual outside journalists asking outside questions. So you can surmise from that the inside journalists are not merely tolerated, but that they're agents, they're assets of what's happening inside.
I live in Canada, and our analogy to the New York Times is the Globe and Mail. It's the old gray lady, so to speak. It's prestigious. Every law firm, every accounting firm, every stockbroker reads it. And by the way, they do some excellent journalism like the New York Times does. But you don't truly understand the purpose of the Globe and Mail, just like you don't truly understand the purpose of the Washington Post or the New York Times, unless you know who owns it. And in the case of the New York Times, it's Mexico's richest man, Carlos Slim, who has tremendous interests in America and the world. In the case of Washington Post, it's Jeffrey Bezos, one of the richest men in the world. And in the case of Canada's Globe and Mail, the richest Canadian, the oligarch David Thompson, worth $23 billion, that's his. He doesn't own it to make money. He owns it to shape the national conversation, either to suit his own business interests or because he has an ideology that he wants to promulgate. So when I learned that the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail is going as an insider, I don't think, wow, they're going to blow the lid off it. I think, oh, our oligarch is harmonizing with their oligarchs, so all the birds can fly in the V formation so naturally. That's what I think when I learned the Globe and Mail is sending a journalist, their top journalist. That's really David Thompson's man. That's who's going.
That's what I would agree with that completely. And I think that explains an awful lot of what we have seen from the kind of big established media outlets. And to your point that they do some excellent journalism, of course they must. If they were pure, relentless, uniform propaganda, eventually people would catch on. There would be no way to point at legitimate articles and say, but look at this. And it takes only a small percentage of their output to be genuine narrative shaping propaganda to do tremendous amounts of damage or to suppress certain types of stories. There are lots of things they can do. But I would agree with you completely that if they're going on the inside, then they are on the inside, and one does not get on the inside of Davos without being useful to Davos. This isn't an open public forum. This is a very, very selective, very, very exclusive meeting. So you must draw these conclusions.
Yeah. I was always vaguely aware of the World Economic Forum. We have some crusading journalists in Canada like Terry Corcoran of the Financial Post who always wrote about them. But I thought, oh, that's Terry again. And I never looked at it until Justin Trudeau became prime minister. And it was one of his first and splashiest trips. And he brought an enormous entourage of journalists with him. And when he went to Davos, he met with George Soros. And they gave the photo of that to the press. They were so proud of that. And there was all these weird celebrities like Kevin Spacey that Trudeau met with and took photos with. And it wasn't just the grossness of Justin Trudeau's debut, showing everyone his fancy socks. That was his big move, his conversation starter. Look at my funny socks I'm wearing. That was the thing. But it was how the journalists were so gaga over this cool dude after the stodgy accountant Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the Conservative. I started really paying attention to it then. And there's that side to it too. There's, it's sort of like Monaco or Cannes, these cool French cities for billionaires and beautiful people. Maybe this is like the Cannes or Monaco for ugly Bond villains. Like they've got as much money for sure. I mean, Soros and Bill Gates are there. There are some loser Hollywood types hanging around. U2's Bono hangs out. But really, this is for people. I mean, they say showbiz, politics is showbiz for ugly people. Well, maybe the World Economic Forum is Monaco for diabolical Bond villains or something. They're trying to be cool, but really they want to manipulate the world. I don't know. I'm
I
still
mean,
working on that.
no, you look at Klaus Schwab and you wonder how he came directly out of central casting, and you start wondering what Mike Myers knew when he did Austin Powers with Dr. Evil. I mean, it's just unbelievable. What Davos represents, though, what the World Economic Forum meeting represents, and what the World Economic Forum itself represents, and a lot of people don't understand the nuance here, is the attempt to forge what they call a public-private partnership. It is the goal. The goal is to put world leaders like Trudeau or Biden or Macron or whoever in the same room under the same kind of, emotional connection, collaborative experience with major industry leaders in businesses, along with major leaders in the nonprofit or non-governmental organization sector. And so you have this meeting of think tanks, government officials, and big business, along with under that, large media magnates and their representatives. And the goal is to get them into a collaborative mode of thought.
That's an excerpt from my show every night. It's called the Ezra Levant Show. That's me, Ezra Levant. You can see the whole thing behind our paywall. Well, there's a lot of goodies behind there. I do a show every weeknight. My friends Sheila Gunn Reid and David Menzies and Nat and Kat have their shows too. You get a ton of content for just $8 a month. There's so much in there you won't find anywhere else. Go to rebelnewsplus.com.